In the early months of his return to power, President Donald Trump has made a series of provocative declarations that raise serious concerns about his approach to international norms. He has floated the idea of employing military force to take control of Greenland and the Panama Canal, entertained the notion of the United States assuming authority over Gaza following the removal of its Palestinian population, and urged Ukraine to surrender territory to Russia as a condition for peace. While such statements might initially be dismissed as part of Trump's familiar pattern of theoretically and incendiary rhetoric, they in fact reflect a more deliberate pattern, one that challenges a core tenet of international law: the prohibition against using or threatening force to resolve conflicts between states. Welcome back to Diplomacy and Discourse, where we break down the global currents shaping our world. I'm your host, AR, and today's episode dives into a topic that sits at the crossroads of history, law, and power: the unraveling of post-World War II legal order, specifically the prohibition on war and conquest. This episode will explore how recent political shifts, especially in the United States, are threatening the fragile system that kept great powers in check and preserved peace for nearly 8 decades. I want to be clear, what you'll hear today is a mix of researched facts and personal analysis. My goal isn't to preach, but to spark dialogue. So if you agree, disagree, or have your own take, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going. Before the 20th century, legal theorists believed not only that countries could wage war to seize others' land and resources, but also that in some circumstances, they should. War was considered legal, the primary way to enforce national rights and resolve disputes between states. That all changed in 1928, when nearly every country in the world at the time joined the Kellogg-Briand Pact, agreeing that wars of aggression should be illegal and territorial conquests prohibited. The 1945 UN Charter reaffirmed and expanded that commitment, putting at its core a prohibition on the, quote, threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state, end quote. Having discovered that merely agreeing to prohibit war was not by itself enough, states then went to extraordinary lengths to design frameworks and institutions to cement this essential rule, leading to the establishment of a new legal order that elevated economic tools over military might to ensure peace. As a result, wars between states became far less common. In the 65 years after the last settlements of World War II, the amount of territory conquered by foreign states each year plummeted to less than 6% of what it had been for just over a century before the world first outlawed war. The number of countries tripled from 1945 to today, as states no longer feared that they would be gobbled up by more powerful neighbors, and countries traded more freely with one another, knowing that the wealth they accumulated was less likely to be plundered by other states. The world became more peaceful and prosperous. The influence of the prohibition on the use of force had already eroded somewhat before Trump returned to office. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, justifying the war by claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction that it did not possess. China has spent the last decade building military bases in contested areas of the South China Sea, and Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 set off the largest land war in Europe since World War II. But Trump is shredding what is left of the norm against using force. Until now, the United States had played a critical, if imperfect, role in maintaining and defending the post-war legal order. The resilience of that order depended less on total compliance with international law than on shared set of expectations about how other countries would behave, even if a country was not itself committed to the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force. It knew that violating the norm would likely trigger condemnation, sanctions, and perhaps even lawful intervention from the United States and its allies. The old assumption that the United States would serve as a guardian of the international norm against war and territorial conquest has unraveled. Trump is not simply stepping back from that historic responsibility. He appears to be actively dismantling it. His posture suggests a desire to re-legitimize war, or at least the credible threat of it, as a routine instrument for resolving international disputes and securing economic advantage. Around the world, other leaders are beginning to adjust to this new, more volatile reality. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu offered tacit support for Trump's comments about Gaza. In a gesture seemingly aimed at appeasement, Panama agreed to accept U.S. deportation flights of non-citizens and approved the stationing of American military forces near the Panama Canal. Meanwhile, as Trump dangled the prospects of permitting Russia to absorb parts of Ukraine, Kiev moved to solidify its relationship with Washington by granting U.S. access to its valuable mineral reserves. Should this unraveling of legal norms go unchallenged, the result could be a dangerous regression, a return to an era when brute force dictated international affairs. The ripple effects would be severe: a resurgence in global militarization, a spike in wars of expansion, the contraction of global trade, and a breakdown in the collective cooperation essential for tackling common existential challenges. For much of history prior to World War I, war was not seen as a failure of diplomacy or international order. It was the recognized mechanism by which that order functioned. Without a central authority or global court to resolve disputes between sovereign nations, states relied on armed conflict as a legitimate tool to assert their rights. War, in this sense, was governed not by moral outrage, but by legal reasoning. Governments routinely issued formal war manifestos that outlined the justifications for military action, which could range from damage to national property, such as attacks on ships, to unpaid debts, violations of treaties, or self-defense. The use of force, when backed by a legal rationale, was not only accepted but expected. As Hugo Grotius, the 17th century Dutch jurist widely regarded as a foundational figure in international law, argued in his Commentary on the Law of Prize and Booty, a war was deemed just, quote, if it consists in the execution of a right, end quote. Because war was traditionally viewed as a legitimate way to enforce legal rights, the doctrine of conquest held a recognized place within the framework of international law. Victorious states could lawfully claim territory or resources as compensation for the wrongs that justified the war in the first place. As Hugo Grotius noted, in securing prize or booty, a state acquires, quote, through war that which is rightfully its own, end quote. Of course, in practice, powerful nations often stretched or fabricated claims to justify territorial expansion. Yet, in a world without a higher legal authority to arbitrate such matters, these justifications were rarely challenged in any binding way. As a result, the international system operated on the assumption that conquests were lawful by default. In essence, might conferred legitimacy. A case in point is the U.S. war against Mexico in 1846, which was formally justified on the grounds of unpaid Mexican debt. When the dust settled, the United States compelled Mexico to sign a treaty that transferred over 500,000 square miles of territory, land that would become much of the American Southwest, in exchange for $15 million and the cancellation of those debts. This pattern was by no means an anomaly. Throughout the 19th century, powerful nations frequently resorted to what became known as gunboat diplomacy, the strategic use of military intimidation to extract political or economic concessions from weaker states. The logic was straightforward. If going to war was considered a lawful means of defending national rights, then threatening war could likewise be deemed legitimate. A striking example occurred in early 1854, when U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay, modern-day Tokyo, with a fleet of warships, asserting that the United States had a legal entitlement to trade with Japan. Perry made it unmistakably clear that refusal to open Japanese ports would be met with force. The implied threat proved effective. On March 31, 1854, the Treaty of Kanagawa was signed, granting American vessels access to 2 Japanese ports and marking the beginning of Japan's forced integration into the global trade system. Because war was historically understood as a legitimate tool for upholding legal rights, engaging in warfare was considered an exercise in law enforcement, not an act of criminality. States that waged war were not seen as violating international norms, but rather asserting them by force. This perspective helps explain why, after Napoleon Bonaparte's defeat in the War of the Sixth Coalition in 1814, the Allied European powers did not prosecute him as a war criminal. Instead, they exiled him to the island of Elba, granting him the title of emperor and allowing him to govern the island with a degree of sovereign authority. Even after his dramatic return to France and ultimate defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon's fate was exiled once again, not as punishment for wrongdoing, but as a precautionary move. His removal to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic was intended to prevent any further destabilization of Europe, not to hold him accountable under any concept of international criminal justice. In addition to the accepted right of conquest and the widespread use of gunboat diplomacy, states that engaged in war were shielded from criminal accountability. But the legal framework of the time also placed firm constraints on neutral parties. Countries that remained outside the conflict were expected to observe strict neutrality, refraining from actions, such as imposing sanctions, that might hinder either side's ability to pursue its perceived legal claims through war. Economic penalties against warring states were viewed not as legitimate diplomatic tools, but as unlawful interference. In fact, if a neutral state breached its duty of impartiality, it risked being considered a legitimate target of war itself. Ironically, under this legal logic, territorial conquest was permissible, but economic sanctions aimed at discouraging war could be seen as provocations that justified it. Within this legal framework, which prevailed well into the early 20th century, military force was a routine tool for powerful states to assert their interests, while weaker nations were left with few choices: comply or face destruction. The absence of legal restrictions on conquest meant that borders were constantly redrawn through violence, and empires expanded through brute force, deepening global power imbalances. Trade routes were not negotiated but secured through the presence of warships, and colonial territories were treated as spoils of legal disputes, transferred through treaties signed under duress or after defeat. In such a system, warfare was not an aberration but a feature of international life, and the perpetual threat of conflict cast a long shadow over global economic development, stalling progress and reinforcing inequality. World War I introduced a scale of destruction the world had never seen, fueled by unprecedented technologies of warfare and the involvement of over 20 nations. The death toll reached an estimated 20 million, with civilians making up nearly half the casualties. As the guns fell silent, the international community was left grappling with how to prevent such mass devastation from reoccurring. One of the first major efforts to address this came with the creation of the League of Nations in 1920, envisioned as a body that would maintain global peace through collective security. Yet its potential was severely undermined from the outset. The U.S. Senate, deeply cautious about entangling the country in further European conflicts, refused to ratify membership, crippling the League's authority and diminishing its capacity to enforce its ideals. Amid the global reckoning that followed World War I, an ambitious new vision took shape: the idea that war itself could be outlawed. In late 1927, U.S. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg advanced this bold proposal to French Prime Minister Aristide Briand, suggesting a formal international agreement to renounce war as a tool of statecraft. Remarkably, the idea gained rapid traction. By 1928, the resulting Kellogg-Briand Pact, officially known as the General Treaty for Renunciation of War as an instrument of national policy, had been signed by 58 nations, encompassing the vast majority of the global community at the time. The treaty marked a watershed moment in international law, declaring that states would no longer resort to war to resolve their disputes. Signatories pledged to, quote, condemn recourse to war for the solution of international controversies, end quote, and to resolve their differences by, quote, passive means, end quote, signaling a collective commitment to a new era of diplomacy over violence. Although the Kellogg-Briand Pact is often dismissed as an idealistic failure, especially in light of its inability to prevent World War II, it quietly laid the groundwork for a transformative shift in international law. Critics have long viewed the pact as toothless, but its deeper impact was more profound than even its creators likely anticipated. By formally declaring war illegal, the treaty forced a fundamental rethinking of nearly every aspect of international legal practice. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Stimson faced the challenge of responding in a way that upheld the pact's principles. After months of deliberation, he announced that the United States would not recognize territorial acquisitions made through aggression. This stance, which became known as the Stimson Doctrine, marked a pivotal moment. It signaled the end of the age in which conquest was legally accepted. Under this emerging norm, even if Japan coerced China into formalizing its gains through a treaty, such agreements would carry no legal legitimacy. The message was clear: military might would no longer validate legal claims, and gunboat diplomacy would no longer produce binding obligations. While both Germany and Japan, despite being signatories to the Kellogg-Briand Pact, blatantly violated its principles by igniting World War II, they ultimately bore the weight of its legal and moral consequences. The territories they seized through military aggression were stripped away, and the highest-ranking officials were brought before international tribunals to answer for their actions. At the Nuremberg trials, the very first charge leveled against the Nazi leadership was the deliberate planning and execution of an aggressive war, a direct violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. The indictment made clear that their war-making was not merely a geopolitical failure, but a prosecutable offense under emerging norms of international law. The principles enshrined in the Kellogg-Briand Pact reshaped not only the legality of war itself, but also the broader framework of international law. One key shift emerged in how neutrality was understood. In 1941, U.S. Attorney General Robert Jackson defended the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the United States to supply arms to nations resisting Nazi Germany without officially entering the war, by arguing that traditional neutrality laws had evolved. Since signatory states had pledged to renounce war as a tool of national policy, Jackson contended a country that violated this agreement forfeited any claim to equal treatment under neutrality laws. As he put it, An aggressor state, quote, acquires no right to equality of treatment from other states, end quote. In this view, neutrality no longer required strict impartiality. Rather, it permitted states to support victims of aggression without breaching legal norms. In essence, the transformation of international norms began with the signing of the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. But ideals alone proved insufficient. Global leaders soon recognized that lasting change required more than declarations. It demanded enforceable rules and durable institutions. In the aftermath of World War II, the Allied powers took concrete steps to solidify this shift by establishing the United Nations, which enshrined the rejection of aggressive war into binding international law. The UN Charter explicitly forbids, quote, the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, end quote, turning the pact's moral vision into legal obligation. Treaties obtained through coercion were now deemed invalid. The traditional requirement of neutrality gave way to a more principled stance against aggression, and individuals who initiated wars of conquest could be prosecuted as criminals under international law. The legal revolution that followed World War II, spearheaded in large part by the United States, stands as one of the most significant transformations in the history of international relations. In the nearly 80 years since the UN Charter came into force, the landscape of global conflict has fundamentally changed. Interstate wars and acts of territorial conquest, once common features of international politics, have become strikingly rare. Since 1945, the world's great powers have avoided direct military confrontation with one another, and no member state of the United Nations has been permanently erased through conquest. While violence and conflict still persist, their frequency and scale have diminished dramatically. To put the shift into perspective, in the 100 years leading up to World War II, more than 150 territorial conquests succeeded. In the decades that followed, that number has fallen to fewer than 10. While some scholars attribute the post-World War II peace to factors like nuclear deterrence, democratic expansion, or the integration of global markets, these explanations often overlook a critical development: the formal outlawing of war. The shift in legal norms fundamentally altered the calculus of international conduct. A vivid example came in August 1990 when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in direct violation of UN Charter's prohibition on aggression. In essence, the UN Security Council swiftly demanded Iraq's withdrawal and, when that demand was ignored, authorized the use of all necessary means to restore peace and security. The United States led a multinational coalition that forcibly removed Iraqi forces from Kuwaiti territory. This episode sent a clear message: breaches of the legal ban on force would not be ignored. The prohibition mattered not only because states believed they should follow it, but because it redefined their expectations, particularly regarding how major powers like the United States would react. The law, in effect, changed the cost-benefit analysis of military aggression. The ban on territorial conquest fundamentally transformed the way nations pursued wealth and power. Prior to its establishment, a state's prosperity was often tied to its ability to seize land, extract resources, or impose concessions through force. War was not only a tool of statecraft. It was a recognized path to economic gain. The post-war legal order, by stripping away the legitimacy of conquest, closed that avenue. In its place, it incentivized peaceful methods of growth, with international trade becoming the primary engine of national prosperity. As military aggression lost its legal and political utility, states increasingly turned to economic cooperation, competitive markets, and the unhindered movement of goods and capital. The prohibition on war and the rise of global trade were not parallel trends. They were deeply interconnected, reshaping the incentives that had long governed international behavior. As the legitimacy of gunboat diplomacy faded, great powers had to adapt new strategies to assert influence, replacing coercion through force with what came to be known as checkbook diplomacy. In this new era, economic and diplomatic pressure, not military intervention, became the principal tool for enforcing international norms. As global economic interdependence deepened, states developed increasingly sophisticated methods of outcasting, denying violators access to the benefits of international collaboration. Trade sanctions, in particular, emerged as a powerful mechanism to penalize actions ranging from human rights abuses and support for terrorism to unlawful wars of aggression. This shift was underpinned by a dramatic transformation in the global economy. In 1945, trade represented just about 10% of the world's GDP. By 2023, it accounted for 58%. Alongside this, tens of thousands of international institutions were formed, and more than 250,000 treaties were drafted to govern this expanding web of interdependence. In such a world, exclusion from international cooperation became not only a diplomatic setback, but a costly economic burden few nations could afford to bear. The United States, with its dominant share of global GDP and unique position of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, acquired exceptional leverage in shaping and enforcing the post-war legal order. For most nations, maintaining favorable relations with Washington was not just strategic, it was economically essential. While the US role in this system was far from flawless, evidenced by controversial military interventions such as the Vietnam War, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and prolonged counterterrorism operations in the Middle East, many of which were justified through expansive interpretations of self-defense, it nonetheless adhered to a crucial boundary. It did not pursue territorial conquest. More importantly, the United States often acted as a guarantor of the international order, committing to defend allies under collective security agreements such as NATO, the Rio Treaty, and defense pacts with nations like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, Australia, and New Zealand. Its response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 made a powerful statement. Even absent from formal treaty obligations, attempts at aggressive conquest would be met with forceful opposition. Although the system was imperfect, it functioned well enough to deter major wars between powerful states and to preserve the integrity of a global order rooted in interdependence. Within this environment, states could focus on building their economies without the looming threat of conquest or being strong-armed into surrendering wealth through unequal treaties. That fragile order may now be on the verge of unraveling. Past U.S. administrations have rightly faced criticism for inconsistencies and double standards, but what sets the Trump administration apart is its apparent readiness to abandon the foundational principle that war should not be used to resolve international disputes. The notion that the United States could forcibly acquire territories like Canada, Greenland, or the Panama Canal, or assert control over Gaza, is not a novel form of hard-nosed realism or transactional diplomacy. It is a revival of an older, more dangerous logic, that power alone justifies action. In both rhetoric and policy, Trump has revived the pre-Kellogg-Briand worldview, one in which the threat or use of force is once again treated as a legitimate tool for negotiating outcomes and extracting concessions. It marks a regression, not just from the norms of post-war diplomacy, but from the legal and moral evolution that followed the catastrophic lessons of the 20th century. Beyond threatening territorial seizures by the United States, the Trump administration also appears ready to abandon the broader international principle that states have a right not to be conquered. In a striking episode, Trump reportedly told Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that if he did not entertain a U.S.-brokered peace deal, one that, according to the Financial Times, might require Ukraine to relinquish up to 20% of its territory to Russia, he risked, quote, losing his whole country, end quote. This posture signals a willingness not only to ignore acts of aggression, but to preserve vulnerable states into accepting them. Trump has also revived gunboat diplomacy by leveraging threats of military action to force other nations into deals favorable to the United States, as seen in negotiations with Canada and Mexico. Meanwhile, his erratic use of tariffs, such as the imposition of 25% duties on key trading partners without clear legal justification, further undermines the credibility of economic sanctions as tools of lawful enforcement. Sanctions derive their power from being used selectively and in response to clear violations of international norms. When wielded impulsively or punitively outside the legal framework, as Trump's trade policies often were, they weaken the legitimacy of economic pressure as a response to genuine misconduct. Trump's decision to authorize sanctions against officials of the International Criminal Court marked a striking reversal in the use of sanctions as a legal tool. Rather than reinforcing international norms, the move weaponized sanctions against those tasked with upholding them, transforming an instrument of justice into one of intimidation. At a broader level, his isolationist economic agenda undermines the very interdependence that allows states to hold violators accountable through nonviolent means. By weakening global ties, Trump reduces the effectiveness of outcasting, the practice of excluding rogue actors from the benefits of international cooperation, thereby leaving states with fewer peaceful options to respond to breaches of international law. In this environment, the risk grows that countries may turn back to force or simply tolerate violations without consequences. Though often dismissed as erratic or improvisational, Trump's rhetorical outburst and policy maneuvers reflect a deliberate and dangerous challenge to the legal architecture built after World War II. This disruption is particularly alarming given that it originates from the very nation that helped construct and for decades sustained that order. While some of his proposals may never be enacted due to judicial checks or political resistance, the damage lies in the signaling itself. The mere threat of dismantling long-standing norms erodes the mutual expectations that have restrained aggression and preserved international stability. When norms are degraded by the world's most powerful actor, it sends a message that the rules are negotiable, weakening their deterrent effect for all. Those shared expectations that states will generally act as if legal rules matter, are what give the international system coherence and predictability. They enable weaker nations to make strategic decisions without fearing predation, encouraging cross-border investment and cooperation, and create space for collective response to lawbreaking. If the United States, with its unparalleled influence, begins to act as though these norms no longer apply, others will likely follow. The resulting unraveling will not be sudden, but it will be steady, chipping away at the foundation of the global legal order until it can no longer function. What remains could be a world where power, not principle, once again defines the limits of international behavior. If the norm prohibiting the use of force continues to erode, the world may revert to a system dominated by great power spheres of influence, one shaped less by law and more by coercion. Leaders like Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, and Xi Jinping could tactically agree to divide the globe into regional zones of control, where each would exert unchecked authority over weaker neighbors. Within these spheres, smaller states could face relentless pressure to offer concessions in exchange for security, transforming international relations into a transactional form of subjugation. While such an arrangement might produce short-term stability, it would come at the cost of freedom and sovereignty. More likely, however, the collapse of the prohibition on war would unleash a resurgence of frequent and localized conflicts, the very kind of instability that the modern legal order was designed to prevent. In Thucydides' enduring phrase, it would mark the return of a world where, quote, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. There is, however, still a path forward, but it demands bold leadership and swift coordination. In 2022, 142 countries stood alongside the United States in endorsing a UN General Assembly resolution denouncing Russia's attempted annexation of Ukrainian territory as illegal. This overwhelming support reveals a latent global consensus that could be harnessed to reaffirm the ban on conquest, this time without depending on the United States as the central enforcer. Encouragingly, Europe has begun to fill the vacuum left by Washington's retreat. After a controversial March meeting in the White House, where Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance openly derided Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and hinted at abandonment, European leaders swiftly rallied behind Ukraine. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that European nations would ramp up defense spending and forge a coalition of the willing to support Ukraine's sovereignty, while European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen committed to unveiling a strategic aid plan on behalf of the EU. Yet Europe cannot and should not be expected to simply replace the United States as the world's de facto guarantor of peace. It lacks the unified military capability, global economic clout, and political cohesion needed to carry that mantle alone. Moreover, even if it could, substituting one hegemon for another would repeat the structural flaws of the old system. Any serious effort to uphold the prohibition on force must reckon with the inequities baked into the existing international order. When the United Nations was created, 5 dominant powers, China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States, granted themselves permanent seats on the Security Council and vetoed authority over all enforcement actions. This power imbalance, coupled with America's outsized influence, has allowed repeated violations, such as the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, to go unpunished. Without structural reform and shared accountability, any new enforcement regime risks reproducing the very vulnerabilities that now threaten to bring the old one down. The credibility of the post-war legal order, particularly its prohibition on the use of force, has been severely weakened by its internal contradictions, especially in the eyes of many states in the global south. For decades, these states have watched as powerful countries preached legal norms while violating them with impunity, fueling deep skepticism about the fairness and legitimacy of the system. This distrust risks obscuring what is truly at stake if leaders like Donald Trump succeed in dismantling the prohibition altogether. Acknowledging these long-standing flaws and the inconsistencies of the system's architects is not an act of self-destruction. It is the necessary foundation for building a more inclusive and resilient global order. Preserving the legal ban on force will require new thinking about international governance, rooted in shared responsibility. Rather than depending on a single dominant power, a reimagined peacekeeping system must empower a broader array of states to uphold legal norms, making those norms more durable and less vulnerable to shifts in any one nation's politics. To achieve this, smaller and mid-sized countries must step forward to lead. The assumption that a stable international order requires a singular great power to act as a guarantor has long gone unchallenged, but it underestimates the power of coordinated action. Collective influence, when states align their efforts around shared legal principles, can rival or even surpass the influence of any one hegemon. The European Union offers a compelling model. While none of its 27 members individually wields global power, together they have forged one of the world's most cohesive and influential political blocs. This shows that by building broad-based alliances, states that might otherwise feel powerless in the face of global instability can shape international outcomes and defend core legal norms. The United Nations General Assembly, where all 193 member states hold equal voting rights, should be positioned to take on a more assertive role in this evolving order. Although it lacks the enforcement authority of the Security Council, the General Assembly is explicitly charged with upholding peace and security, and recent developments show its untapped potential. In response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the General Assembly activated a new veto initiative that allows it to take up and debate any resolution blocked by a permanent Security Council member. Through this process, the Assembly helped legitimize international sanctions, facilitated the delivery of weapons and financial aid to Ukraine, and initiated a reparations framework through a global register of war damages. These actions illustrate how a revitalized General Assembly can help enforce international law, even without direct coercive power, by coordinating collective responses and amplifying global consensus. Regional and issue-based coalitions also offer promising pathways for reinforcing the prohibition on force. These networks, forged through shared goals rather than geographic proximity alone, are beginning to take shape. The Council of Europe, for instance, is establishing a special tribunal to compile evidence and pursue legal accountability for Russian aggression in Ukraine. Meanwhile, a bloc of countries known as the Hague Group, including Bolivia, Colombia, Cuba, Honduras, Malaysia, Namibia, Senegal, and South Africa, is actively working to implement decisions from the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court regarding the conflict in Gaza. In May, foreign ministers from the African Union and the European Union pledged deeper cooperation on peace, security, and development, laying the groundwork for a transcontinental peace coalition that could function independently of U.S. leadership. These efforts underscore a growing recognition that safeguarding international law is not the burden of a few, but the shared responsibility of many. While the UN Security Council remains the only formal body authorized to sanction war in the name of enforcing international law, its limitations are increasingly apparent, especially when one of its permanent members is the violator. There is nothing preventing states from forming an independent outcasting council, a coalition capable of coordinating joint economic and diplomatic penalties against states that breach fundamental norms, such as the prohibition on the use of force. Sanctions have often failed to deter unlawful behavior, largely because they are reactive, inconsistently applied, and slow to organize. But if countries commit to acting in unison through pre-agreed mechanisms, they could transform sanctions into a far more reliable and potent tool. Institutionalizing such coordination would give legitimacy and teeth to the enforcement of international law, without relying solely on the dysfunctional Security Council. Preserving the prohibition on force ultimately depends on states recognizing both its historical achievements and the dangers posed by its unraveling. The international community must not passively accept the United States' retreat from its enforcement role, but instead respond by building new institutions to fill the void. Doing so would send a clear signal that the commitment to legality and restraint is broader than any one nation, and that global norms are not subject to unilateral revision by any single power, even one as dominant as the United States. If Washington were to make good on its threats to seize assets like the Panama Canal, other nations could respond with collective economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or even the withdrawal of basing rights granted to the U.S. military. Such actions would not only reaffirm the international legal order, but demonstrate that a wider array of countries are both willing and capable of defending it. The threat to the post-war order does not originate solely from the United States. Russia and China are also actively working to reshape global norms to better serve their geopolitical ambitions. The durability of the international legal system will hinge on whether a more diverse group of states, large and small, global north and south, can take shared responsibility for upholding its core principles. Yet, this will require difficult shifts in global power dynamics. It is uncertain whether historically dominant powers such as France, Germany, and the United Kingdom are prepared to relinquish their privileged influence, or whether long marginalized countries can trust a legal order that has often failed them. Still, committing to a legal system built on the prohibition of war remains vital. The temptation for smaller states to play major powers off one another may yield short-term gains, but in the long run, it risks turning them into pawns in a renewed era of great power rivalry, stripped of agency and sovereignty. The post-1945 international system, however flawed, brought the world unprecedented stability and prosperity. But it will not endure without intentional effort. Its survival depends on the recognition that peace is not self-sustaining. It must be actively protected and reimagined in every generation. After the outbreak of World War II, American leaders understood that the failure to build a stable order after World War I had enabled catastrophe. They resolved not to repeat that mistake. The lesson of history is clear. Waiting until the chaos has subsided to chart a new course guarantees failure. As the post-war system comes under pressure from within and without, today's leaders must act with foresight, not only to defend what has been built, but to design new institutions, alliances, and mechanisms that can safeguard peace in a rapidly changing world. Failing to do so invites the return of an era where law yields to power and diplomacy gives way to force. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with this. The international order we've come to rely on didn't build itself, and it won't survive passively. The idea that war is not an acceptable tool of statecraft took generations to construct, and it can be undone in a matter of years, or even moments. Whether it's Trump's rhetoric, Russia's aggression, or China's ambitions, the challenge ahead is clear. But so is the opportunity. Countries, big and small, have the chance to reclaim ownership of the rules and reaffirm that law, not force, should shape our world. Thanks for tuning in to Diplomacy and Discourse. If you got thoughts, whether you agree, disagree, or want to add something new, drop a comment, send a message, and let's keep this conversation alive. Until next time, stay sharp, stay curious, and stay engaged.